what if I told you that the most infamous how-to guide for tyrants and dictators, like a book that is practically synonymous with political evil, was never actually meant to be a rule book at all?
Yeah, that's a pretty bold claim to make right out of the gate.
I know, right? But today we are opening up Niccolò Machiavelli's infamous masterwork, The Prince, along with, a few of his other historical writings.
Right, like his accounts of the ruthless Dukes of Tsar Borgia and the warlord Castruccio Castracani.
Exactly. And for hundreds of years, people have just treated this material as a rigid playbook for backstabbing your way to power.
Yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate reputation of Machiavellianism. People assume he just sat down and wrote this, like, checklist for sociopaths.
But when you actually dig into the text, a completely different picture emerges. So I'm really glad you, the listener, are joining us for this deep dive because we're looking past the surface level cliches today.
We really are.
Our mission today is to investigate exactly how Machiavelli uses ancient history, specifically Roman history, to make his points. We want to figure out if he's just handing out a static list of political principles, or if he's secretly trying to teach his readers something much deeper.
Namely, how to think historically through these examples. Right?
Yes, because, that distinction changes everything about how we read him.
Oh, absolutely. Because if The Prince is just a literal playbook, well, it becomes outdated the moment the political landscape shifts.
Right.
The tactics of the 16th century don't really apply to, a modern boardroom or a 21st century geopolitical crisis. But if it is a framework for analytical thinking, well, that becomes timeless.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out if he's actually teaching us how to think, we first have to look at his absolute obsession with the past.
Yeah, he's constantly forcing his readers to look backward at ancient figures.
Right, and to explain why, he uses this brilliant visual metaphor of a clever archer. He notes that human beings generally walk in paths beaten by others, right? Just imitating what came before.
But because we can never perfectly match the greatness of the past, a wise person should act like a highly skilled archer who has a target that is incredibly far away.
Yeah, and he paints a very specific physical picture here. The archer knows the exact limit of the strength of their bow. They know the weight of the arrow, and they understand the distance to the target.
So they don't just aim straight at it.
Exactly. Rather than aiming directly at the distant bullseye, they elevate their bow and take aim much, much higher.
But they aren't shooting into the sky just to shoot into the sky or hoping for a miracle.
No.
They are calculating the arc. They use that higher trajectory so the arrow will drop down and hit the true practical mark.
And Machiavelli backs this up with this whole lineage of historical imitation. He points out that Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the known world, constantly imitated Achilles.
The mythical warrior from the Trojan War.
Right. Then generations later, Julius Caesar studied and imitated Alexander.
Yeah, and the great Roman general Scipio imitated Cyrus, the ancient founder of the Persian Empire. It's this continuous chain of high aiming.
But, so let's look at the mechanics of that imitation, because it's not like Julius Caesar was literally putting on a Greek breastplate, grabbing a spear, and trying to recreate Alexander the Great's exact battle formations point by point.
Yeah, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
The terrain was different, the enemies were different, the weapons had evolved.
Exactly. It's like studying a chess grandmaster's past games. You aren't memorizing the sequence of moves just to blindly copy them on the board because your opponent will undoubtedly do something different on move 4.
Right.
You are studying the thinking behind the moves. But if the goal is to hit our own modern targets, how exactly does Machiavelli want us to apply these ancient high aims?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to a core tenet of Machiavelli's worldview. The reason studying that grandmaster's thinking works is because he fundamentally believes human conditions and human nature do not change.
Really? At all?
At all. The costumes evolve, the technology advances, the borders move. But the underlying psychological motivations, greed, fear, ambition, the desire for security, they remain entirely constant across millennia.
So the human software just hasn't been updated since antiquity.
Precisely. So by aiming at the highest examples of statecraft figures like Moses or Cyrus Machiavelli, argues that we learn how to recognize opportunities.
Opportunities that fortune gives us.
Yes. He is very explicit about this. He writes that these great historical founders owed nothing to fortune beyond opportunity. Fortune simply provided the raw material for them to mold.
I see.
If you haven't trained your mind by studying the high aims of the past, Fortune might drop the perfect opportunity right into your lap and you won't even realize what it is. You'll just stare at it, waiting around for luck to do the rest of the work.
Wow. Okay, so let's transition from the abstract to the practical then. If the ancients are our high targets, how do we actually take that elevated thinking and apply it to a messy, modern, chaotic situation?
Well, Machiavelli does this by holding up a historical success right next to a contemporary disaster.
Right. Chapter 3. He compares the brilliance of the ancient Romans in Greece to the absolute blundering of the modern King Louis XII of France.
Yeah, when Louis invaded Italy. And the contrast he builds is just systemic and brutal.
It really is. And he frames this comparison using a medical analogy, which I just find this fascinating for a political text.
It's so vivid.
He says political unrest is like a hectic fever, something kind of akin to tuberculosis. In the beginning, this fever is incredibly easy to cure, but very difficult to detect. You might just have, like, a slight cough.
Right, nothing major.
But if you fail to recognize the symptoms early and let the disease progress, it eventually becomes incredibly easy to detect because everyone can see you're dying, but almost impossible to cure.
It is a profound lens for statecraft. He's illustrating that the Romans deeply understood the nature of this political fever. When the Romans entered Greece, they didn't just react to the immediate problems standing right in front of them.
They aggressively foresaw future troubles and acted early.
Exactly. They administered the antibiotics before the infection could spread. They set up colonies. They actively suppressed the powerful local factions like Philip and Antiochus. And crucially, they maintained the minor, weaker powers to keep a favorable balance.
So they essentially managed the political ecosystem.
Yes, beautifully. And then we look at King Louis XII.
Oh, boy. Father of the people back home in France, but an absolute catastrophe in Italy.
Yeah, when Louis invaded the Italian peninsula, which was, this fragile patchwork of competing city-states at the time, he committed 5 massive fatal errors.
Let's break those down because the causality behind each error is what really matters here. First, Louis destroyed the minor powers in Italy.
Huge mistake.
Yeah, why is that bad? Because minor powers act as natural buffer zones and eager allies against your biggest rivals. They want your protection. By wiping them out, Louis essentially removed the political friction that was keeping his bigger enemies at bay.
Which leads directly to his second error. He increased the strength of an already powerful player, the Pope.
Right.
In his effort to secure a quick alliance, Louis gave the church more temporal power, essentially feeding a rival who would inevitably turn on him once they were strong enough.
It's like he's just handing them the weapons. And third, he brought in a massive foreign power, Spain, to help him govern a territory.
Yeah, he essentially invited a starving wolf into the henhouse to help him manage the chickens, and then was somehow surprised when the wolf took over.
Such a disaster. And fourth, he failed to actually go and live in the newly conquered territory.
Which, going back to our medical analogy, is crucial.
Exactly. If the doctor isn't in the room with the patient, they cannot observe those early, subtle symptoms of the hectic fever. Louis couldn't see the rebellions brewing until it was just way too late.
And finally, his 5th error. He failed to send colonies. Instead of setting up small, self-sustaining pockets of loyal citizens who would cheaply anchor his presence in the region, he relied on expensive, massive, occupying armies.
Which just drained his treasury and angered all the locals.
Right. And notice how those 5 modern errors map perfectly, almost inversely, onto the actions the Romans took centuries earlier.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The Romans protected minor powers, they suppressed major ones, kept foreign influence out, and established colonies.
So what does this all mean? Looking at Louis's laundry list of failures, it's really clear this isn't about perfectly mimicking Rome. It's a diagnostic test.
Yes.
He's teaching you, the reader, to look at a leader's actions, hold them up against the Roman historical template, and spot the underlying disease.
And that diagnostic utility is exactly why his language is so clinical here. Machiavelli writes that Louis lost his Italian territories because he and I, quote, did not follow any of the conditions observed by those who had taken possession of countries.
History is the diagnostic manual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You check the symptoms of your current state against historical case studies. If you are boosting a major rival's power while ignoring your minor allies, historical analysis tells you that your state has contracted a terminal fever regardless of how good you feel today.
But, you know, history isn't a fairy tale. It's not some morality play where virtuous actions automatically lead to peace and wicked actions lead to ruin.
No, definitely not.
Sometimes the diagnostic manual prescribes horrific medicine. And this is where Machiavelli's framework demands we embrace some highly uncomfortable, highly contextual realities.
Yeah. And this is exactly where his reputation for ruthlessness originates.
Let's look at how he contrasts two very different military leaders. On one hand, you have Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian general. Machiavelli points out that Hannibal was known for his inhuman cruelty. Yet this very specific, terrifying cruelty is what kept his massive, culturally diverse army perfectly united in foreign lands for years without a single rebellion.
It's wild to think about.
And then contrast him with the Roman general Scipio. By all historical accounts, Scipio was an incredibly virtuous, lenient, and good man. But what happened to Scipio? He faced a massive, dangerous mutiny among his troops in Spain.
Because his leniency caused a breakdown in the chain of command. His soldiers didn't fear the consequences of insubordination, so they just took advantage of his easy nature. The whole structure collapsed under the weight of his virtue.
He draws a similar contrast with Roman emperors, too. You have Marcus Aurelius, the famous Stoic philosopher, a profoundly good man, loved by the people who died honored in his bed.
Right.
But then you have Emperor Severus. Severus was incredibly cruel, rapacious, and oppressed the people. But he succeeded wildly. Machiavelli says Severus succeeded because he mastered the dual nature of power, the lion and the fox.
And that is perhaps his most vital metaphor in the whole book. The lion represents overwhelming physical force, right?
Yeah.
The ability to terrify your enemies and crush wolves.
Yeah.
The fox represents cunning and deception, the ability to recognize and evade political traps. A leader must be both, because a lion cannot protect himself from snares, and a fox cannot defend himself against wolves.
So Severus brilliantly deployed both brute force and deception to manage his deeply corrupt soldiers.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to push back here. If context is the only thing that matters, aren't we just giving tyrants a blank check to commit atrocities?
Yeah.
I mean, any dictator can just claim their state is unstable to justify monstrous behavior. Machiavelli himself brings up Agathocles the Sicilian, a man who gained power by locking all the senators and rich citizens of his city in a room and butchering them.
Yeah, he acted with zero mercy.
Yet Machiavelli explicitly writes that this behavior cannot be called talent and that it gains empire but not glory. So where is the line drawn? If Hannibal's inhuman cruelty is praised, and Severus's cruelty is praised, why is Agathocles condemned? Isn't it all just violence?
This raises an important question, and that tension is the absolute crux of understanding the prince. Machiavelli is not writing a moral defense of cruelty, nor is he offering a blank check for sociopathy.
Okay.
He is analyzing the strict economy of violence. The difference between Marcus Aurelius and Severus, or, Hannibal and Agathocles, is entirely about the starting conditions and the ultimate goal of stability.
How so? Like, what's the actual difference?
Well, Marcus Aurelius inherited a stable, prosperous empire. Because the foundation was solid, his natural goodness and leniency were massive political assets.
Right. He didn't need to break anything to fix it.
Exactly. Severus, however, was a new prince who seized power in a chaotic, deeply corrupt military environment. You cannot imitate the gentle Marcus Aurelius if your state is completely unstable and surrounded by wolves. Your virtue will get you and your citizens killed.
Wow.
You have to imitate the fierce Severus to establish order.
So Agathocles went too far because his cruelty wasn't a calculated necessity to stabilize a fractured state.
Precisely. Machiavelli introduces the concept of cruelty, properly used versus badly employed. Cruelty, properly used, is applied in one swift, decisive blow out of absolute necessity for the security of the state, and then it's never repeated.
The ruler immediately pivots to benefiting the citizens.
Right. Badly employed cruelty, however, might start small but multiplies over time. It becomes the ruler's default setting. Agathocles got the empire, but because his cruelty was endless and served only his own paranoia rather than the stability of the state, history affords him no glory.
That is a chilling distinction, but I mean, it makes total analytical sense within his framework. The violence must have a clinical endpoint.
It has to serve a purpose.
So having seen how to aim high like an archer, how to diagnose political diseases like a doctor, and how to brutally adapt to contexts like the lion and the fox, the logical question is, how does a person train their brain to think this way permanently?
Right. How do you make historical analysis your default operating system? Well, for that, Machiavelli gives us what might be his ultimate role model for this mindset. He introduces a man named Philipomen, a Greek general who lived centuries earlier and led the Achaean League.
Machiavelli seems to absolutely revere this guy's daily habits.
He really does, because Philipomen embodies the active application of history. Machiavelli notes that even in times of perfect peace, Philipomen never stopped thinking about war and strategy.
He didn't view peace as a time to turn off his brain.
No, not at all.
He would go on walks through the countryside with his friends, and he would essentially turn the landscape into a real-time military simulation.
Yeah, so cool.
He'd stop his group and pose hypothetical scenarios. He'd point to the terrain and say, if the enemy should be upon that hill and we are down here with our army, who has the advantage? How should we advance without breaking our ranks? If we need to retreat, how do we do it safely? If they retreat, how do we pursue them?
He was literally running tabletop strategy games in the real world. He debated with his friends, he listened to their opinions, he stated his own, and he applied the rules of historical strategy he had studied to the physical world right in front of him.
Think about why you, the listener, are unpacking all of this right now. You might not be a Greek general trying to conquer a neighboring city-state tomorrow.
Probably not.
But Philipomen's daily habit is the ultimate antidote to modern information overload. We are drowning in data, news, and historical facts today. Philipomen isn't just memorizing facts from a scroll to sound smart at a dinner party. He is actively playing out historical simulations in his head. By looking at a peaceful, empty hill and imagining a complex battle, he is building mental muscles. He's turning static history into a dynamic survival skill.
And what's fascinating here is that the result of that relentless mental training is exactly why Machiavelli includes him. Because Philipomen ran these simulations continuously, Machiavelli writes that there could never arise in time of war any unexpected circumstances that he could not deal with. And that right there is the undeniable proof of Machiavelli's true goal for his readers.
He doesn't want to give you a fish. He doesn't want to just hand you a static political rule like always build fortresses or always ally with the French, because a rule that works perfectly today might destroy your state tomorrow when the context changes.
He wants to teach you how to fish. He wants to train you to think historically, to constantly run these mental simulations based on past human behavior, so that when chaos inevitably hits, your brain already knows how to process the variables.
You move from being a passive victim of circumstance to an active analyst of your reality.
Exactly.
This completely flips the script on how we view the prince. I mean, Machiavelli uses the ancients not as an infallible, dusty rulebook, but as a dynamic lens to view the present.
Yeah.
By aiming high like the clever archer, by diagnosing systemic problems early like the Romans, by adapting ruthlessly to our specific context like Severus, and by constantly running mental simulations like Philipomen, we learn to navigate our own chaotic environments.
We learn to anticipate the shifting landscape, rather than just reacting to it.
Which brings me to a final, somewhat provocative thought I want to leave you with, building on everything we've just explored. Late in the book, Machiavelli compares fortune to a raging, destructive river.
It's a very famous passage.
Yeah. When the river floods, it sweeps away trees, ruins buildings, and terrifies everyone. There is no stopping it in the moment. Unless men have built dams and barriers during times of fair weather.
Right.
If you build the dam in peacetime, the floodwaters can be channeled, controlled, and survived.
It is a beautiful metaphor for intellectual and political preparation.
And then in his very final chapter, Machiavelli shifts his tone entirely. He drops the clinical, analytical voice and makes a passionate, deeply emotional plea to liberate Italy from the foreign invasions that were tearing it apart in his time.
He was devastated by it.
He loved his country, and it was being destroyed by the floodwaters of Spanish and French armies. So, if fortune is a flood, and historical analysis is the material we use to build dams, could it be that Machiavelli wrote The Prince not to kiss up to a specific tyrant, but to serve as the ultimate intellectual dam for his beloved country?
Oh.
Was he secretly trying to teach future generations of Italians how to outthink the floodwaters of history?
It frames the entire work not as a weapon forged for an oppressor, but as a conceptual shield designed for a nation.
It makes you realize that when you step into the world of Machiavelli, you aren't walking into a static museum of villains and despots. You are plugging into a live surveillance feed of human nature, watching the floodwaters rise and learning exactly where to pour the concrete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the surface and always keep looking for the why behind the what.